On a freezing December morning in 1951, Sergeant Robert Lawson and his unit arrived in a village near Incheon in South Korea. It was the height of the Korean War, and North Korean troops could have launched a raid at any moment. The village was in ruins, the houses burned, and the streets empty. Bobby was assigned to comb the village with his unit. It was so cold that his breath steamed in the air, and his hands could barely hold his rifle. The unit's job was to check the village for enemy soldiers, but Bobby was tired of the devastation of war. He was a 25-year-old American soldier, but the war had made him look older than his years. His eyes were always on the lookout, but he felt no threat in this village. The silence of the village disturbed him, as if an explosion was going to happen at any moment. Bobby noticed movement between the ruined walls of a house. He aimed his rifle and approached slowly. A little girl was hiding behind the wall. She must have been about 8 years old, her face covered in dirt and shivering in a thin jacket. Bobby lowered his rifle and approached the girl. She backed away in fear, but Bobby asked her name in a calm voice. The girl whispered, Ji-yeon. Bobby didn't speak Korean, but he could understand her fear. He took a chocolate bar out of his pocket and handed it to her. Ji-yeon hesitated for a moment, but then she took it and a small smile appeared on her face. Bobby asked her about her family, but Ji-yeon shook her head. Her parents had died in the war, and Ji-yeon was trying to survive alone in the village. When Bobby saw the fear and innocence in her eyes, he remembered his own sister, Emily, the younger sister. Bobby went back to his unit and explained the situation, but the commander of the unit, Sergeant Miller, ordered sternly, "We can't linger here. The enemy will be here any minute." Bobby protested to the commander, "We can't leave this girl here." Miller thought for a moment and gave Bobby an hour. Bobby took Ji-yeon into a ruined house and gave her a blanket. Ji-yeon hugged the blanket and thanked Bobby. Bobby gave her some more food and sat with her. The first snow of winter began to fall on the village. Snowflakes fell in Ji-yeon's hair, and her eyes shone as she watched the snow. Bobby admired the innocence of this little girl in the midst of war. Ji-yeon tried to catch the snowflakes with her little hands and turned to Bobby and said something. Bobby didn't understand, but he felt the joy in her voice. At that moment, Bobby forgot the weight of the war, and for a moment he focused only on Ji-yeon's smile. But at that moment, a message came over the unit's radio. North Korean soldiers were approaching the village. Bobby had to come up with a plan to protect Ji-yeon, but the shadow of war was once again threatening innocence. Bobby held Ji-yeon's hand and wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, but the brutality of war made that impossible. Sergeant Robert Lawson was holding Ji-yeon's hand inside a ruined house. It had come over the unit's radio that North Korean troops were approaching in this ruined village near Incheon. Bobby had found Ji-yeon an hour earlier and given her a blanket. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and was trying to survive alone in the village. Bobby gave her a chocolate bar and admired her little smile. As the first snow of winter fell on the village, Ji-yeon tried to catch the snowflakes, and Bobby forgot the weight of the war for a moment. But reality hit him once again with the news over the radio. North Korean soldiers were approaching the village and Bobby had to protect Ji-yeon. Bobby turned to Ji-yeon and in a calm voice told her to stay here and hide. Although Ji-yeon didn't understand, she sensed from Bobby's tone that something was wrong. Bobby left the house to join his unit, but he didn't want to leave Ji-yeon alone. The unit took up a defensive position at the entrance to the village. Sergeant Miller was shouting orders. The enemy was 2 kilometers away. Get ready. Bobby joined his unit, but his mind was on Ji-yeon. He turned to Miller and said there was a girl in the village and we must protect her. Miller looked at him sternly. "We can't protect anyone in a war, Lawson. Focus on your mission." Bobby gritted his teeth, but he had to obey the order. But he came up with a plan. He had to get Ji-yeon out of the village before the enemy got close. Bobby returned to the ruined house. Ji-yeon was sitting in a corner wrapped in a blanket. Bobby reached for her and pulled her out of the house. There was a wooded area north of the village where they could take shelter. Bobby held Ji-yeon's hand tightly and started running through the snow-covered streets. Ji-yeon was trying to keep up with Bobby with small steps, but she was shivering from the cold. Bobby took off his jacket and wrapped it around Ji-yeon. She hugged the jacket and gave Bobby a grateful look. When they reached the forest, Bobby hid under a tree and took Ji-yeon in his arms. She was blue from the cold, but Bobby's warmth comforted her a little. Bobby took a can of food out of his pocket and fed it to Ji-yeon. As Ji-yeon ate the can, a small smile appeared on her face. When Bobby saw that smile, he felt a glimmer of hope in the midst of the war. But then gunshots were heard in the distance. North Korean soldiers had reached the village, and the fighting had started. Bobby hid Ji-yeon under a tree and readied his rifle. Ji-yeon hugged Bobby in fear and whispered, "Don't go." Bobby hugged her and said everything would be all right. But the sounds of fighting were getting closer. Bobby had to make a decision, either to join his unit and fight or to stay here to protect Ji-yeon. Bobby radioed his unit and reported his position. Miller shouted angrily, "Lawson, get over here now!" Bobby turned off the radio and turned to Ji-yeon. She was shaking with fear, but she trusted Bobby. Bobby stroked Ji-yeon's hair and started humming a song to her. It was a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. Ji-yeon was calmed a little by the melody of the lullaby, but the shadow of war once again threatened hope. Sergeant Robert Lawson had hidden Ji-yeon under a tree in the woods north of the village. In this ruined village near Incheon, North Korean soldiers had reached the village and fighting had begun. Bobby took Ji-yeon out of the village and gave him his jacket. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and had taken refuge with Bobby. Bobby hummed a lullaby to her, and Ji-yeon was calmed a little by the melody. But distant gunshots and explosions signaled that war was engulfing the village. Bobby had chosen to protect Ji-yeon instead of joining his unit, but this decision had put him in a difficult position. Sergeant Miller's angry voice echoed over the radio. Lawson shouting for him to get over here now. Bobby turned off the radio and hugged Ji-yeon. Ji-yeon was shivering in Bobby's arms. The cold air and the sounds of war frightened the little girl. Bobby stroked Ji-yeon's hair and told her to calm down. But just then a shadow appeared from the forest. Bobby aimed his rifle and held his breath. The shadow was an American soldier, Tommy, a private in the unit. Tommy approached Bobby breathlessly and whispered, "The enemy has surrounded the village, and our unit is retreating." Bobby showed Tommy Ji-yeon and said, "I must protect this girl." Tommy looked at Ji-yeon for a moment and nodded. "I understand, but the enemy is too close." Bobby had to make a decision. He couldn't leave Ji-yeon in the forest, but it was impossible to join the unit. Tommy made a suggestion. He said there was a hill west of the village and we could take shelter there. Bobby picked up Ji-yeon and walked with Tommy through the woods heading west. The snow was still falling, and their footprints left a distinct imprint in the snow. Ji-yeon was wrapped in Bobby's jacket, her small hands clutching his shirt tightly. Bobby could feel her fear, but he was determined to do everything to protect her. When they reached the top of the hill, they found a cave. It was small but sheltered. Bobby placed Ji-yeon inside the cave, and he and Tommy stood guard at the entrance. Tommy radioed the unit, but the signal was weak. Sergeant Miller's voice was intermittent, saying, "Retreat. The enemy is superior." Ji-yeon was sitting in a corner of the cave, watching the snowflakes, while Bobby listened to the radio. Suddenly, she started coughing. The cold weather and hunger were making Ji-yeon sick. Bobby sat next to Ji-yeon and gave her water. Ji-yeon drank the water, but she couldn't stop coughing. Bobby took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped Ji-yeon's forehead. She was getting feverish. Bobby hugged Ji-yeon and tried to warm her. But just then there was movement at the entrance to the cave. Tommy whispered, "Enemy soldiers." Bobby grabbed his rifle and approached the entrance. Down below the cave, several North Korean soldiers were patrolling. The soldiers were approaching the cave. Bobby signaled Tommy to be quiet. Ji-yeon was still coughing, and her voice might attract the attention of the soldiers. Bobby covered Ji-yeon's mouth with his hand and whispered, "Please be quiet." Ji-yeon shook her head in fear, but couldn't stop coughing. Bobby held his breath as the soldiers reached the entrance to the cave. The shadow of war was once again threatening Ji-yeon's innocence. Sergeant Robert Lawson was hiding with Ji-yeon and Private Tommy in a cave on a hill west of the village. This ruined village near Incheon was surrounded by North Korean troops, and the fighting had intensified. Bobby chose to stay with Ji-yeon instead of joining the unit to protect her. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and sought refuge with Bobby. While hiding in the cave, North Korean soldiers approached the entrance, and Ji-yeon's coughing almost gave them away. Bobby covered Ji-yeon's mouth with his hand and signaled her to be quiet. The soldiers looked around for a while, but moved away without noticing the cave. Bobby took a deep breath and hugged Ji-yeon. She was shaking with fear, and her coughing wouldn't stop. The cold air and hunger were making Ji-yeon sick. Bobby checked Ji-yeon's forehead and noticed that her temperature was rising. The cave was cold and damp, making Ji-yeon's condition worse. As Tommy stood guard at the entrance to the cave, he turned to Bobby and whispered, "This girl is sick and needs a doctor." Bobby nodded, but it was impossible to find a doctor in the middle of the war. Bobby picked Ji-yeon up and took her to a deeper corner of the cave. There he spread a blanket and wrapped Ji-yeon in it. She was blue from the cold, but Bobby's warmth gave her some comfort. Bobby took a can from his pocket and fed it to Ji-yeon. Ji-yeon ate the can in small bites but had no appetite. Bobby gave her water and wiped her forehead with a wet handkerchief. Ji-yeon whispered, "Thank you, brother." Bobby didn't understand the words, but he felt the gratitude in Ji-yeon's voice. Tommy radioed the unit one more time, but the signal was still weak. Sergeant Miller's voice crackled. "We've withdrawn. We're returning to Incheon." Bobby knew it was too late to join the unit, but he couldn't leave Ji-yeon. The cave wasn't safe, and Ji-yeon's condition was deteriorating. Bobby came up with a plan. There was a river south of the village, and there might be a shelter near the river. He hoped he could find food and medicine in the shelter. Bobby put Ji-yeon on his back and turned to Tommy and said, "We are going to the shelter." Tommy nodded and went ahead and looked around. The snow was still falling, and it was getting dark. Bobby carried Ji-yeon on his back, her head resting on his shoulder. Ji-yeon's breathing was getting weaker, and Bobby could feel it. When they reached the river, Bobby found a shelter. The shelter was a small hut and looked abandoned. Bobby went into the hut and put Ji-yeon on a bed. There was a stove in the hut, but no wood. Tommy went out and collected wood from around. Bobby lit the stove, and the hut slowly began to warm up. Ji-yeon felt a little better with the warmth of the stove, but she still had a cough. Bobby found a box in the hut and saw that it contained some medicine and bandages. The medicine was old, but Bobby gave Ji-yeon a pill and put a wet cloth on her forehead. Ji-yeon opened her eyes and sent Bobby a small smile. But just then an explosion was heard outside the hut. North Korean soldiers had reached the riverbank, and war was once again at the door. Sergeant Robert Lawson was hiding in a small hut on the riverbank with Ji-yeon and Private Tommy. The village near Incheon was surrounded by North Korean troops, and the fighting intensified. Bobby found a shelter to protect Ji-yeon, warmed the hut, and gave Ji-yeon medicine. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and sought refuge with Bobby. The cold weather and hunger had made Ji-yeon sick, and she was coughing and running a fever. Bobby lit the stove and put Ji-yeon on a bed. Ji-yeon recovered a little from the warmth of the stove and sent Bobby a small smile. But an explosion was heard outside the hut, and it was clear that North Korean soldiers had reached the riverbank. Bobby looked out the window of the cabin. A few North Korean soldiers were patrolling the riverbank, and the sound of explosions was growing louder. Tommy whispered to Bobby as he stood guard at the entrance, "The enemy is close. We need a plan." Bobby nodded, but Ji-yeon's condition worried him. She was still coughing, and her fever had not gone down. Bobby sat next to Ji-yeon and wiped her forehead with a wet cloth. Ji-yeon opened her eyes and whispered to Bobby, "Where is Mom?" Bobby didn't understand the question, but he felt the longing in Ji-yeon's voice. With her small hands, Ji-yeon took a crumpled piece of paper from her jacket pocket and handed it to Bobby. It was a letter, and it was written in Korean. Bobby couldn't read the writing, but he guessed it was from Ji-yeon's mother. Ji-yeon pressed the letter to her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. Bobby took the letter and hugged Ji-yeon. She started crying and tried to tell Bobby something. Bobby didn't speak Korean, but he could understand that Ji-yeon missed her mom and dad. Ji-yeon pointed to the letter and said something, and Bobby noticed a drawing at the end of the letter. It showed a mother, a father, and a little girl. The family was smiling under a tree. When Bobby saw this drawing, he remembered his own family. His younger sister, Emily, whom he had left in America, used to draw like this. Bobby stroked Ji-yeon's hair and told her to calm down. But Ji-yeon's cough had gotten worse, and she was having trouble breathing. Bobby gave her another one of the pills he had found in the hut, but they were old and had limited effect. As Tommy looked out the window, he noticed movement. North Korean soldiers were approaching the hut. Bobby hid Ji-yeon under the bed and signaled Tommy to defend the entrance. When the soldiers reached the door of the hut, Bobby aimed his rifle. But at that moment, Ji-yeon started coughing from under the bed. The sound attracted the soldiers' attention, and one of them kicked the door in. Bobby immediately fired and hit the soldier, but other soldiers opened fire on the hut. Tommy was wounded in the arm by a bullet, but he kept fighting. Bobby pulled Ji-yeon out from under the bed and held her in his arms. They ran out the back door of the hut, but the soldiers were after them. Bobby put Ji-yeon on his back and ran along the river. Ji-yeon still held the letter in her hand and hugged Bobby and whispered, "Find my mom." The shadow of war darkened Ji-yeon's innocent longing once more. Sergeant Robert Lawson was running along the river with Ji-yeon on his back. In the village near Incheon, North Korean soldiers had raided the hut where they had taken shelter, and Bobby and Ji-yeon had managed to escape through the back door. Tommy was shot in the arm but kept fighting. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and sought refuge with Bobby. The cold weather and hunger made Ji-yeon sick, and her cough and fever intensified. Ji-yeon was holding a letter from her mother and whispered to Bobby to find my mother. As Bobby carried Ji-yeon on his back, North Korean soldiers were in pursuit. They hid behind a rock on the riverbank, and Bobby looked around, panting. The soldiers were still close, but the darkness made it hard to see them. Bobby put Ji-yeon down and hugged her behind the rock. She was blue from the cold and breathing hard. Bobby wrapped his jacket around Ji-yeon and wiped her forehead with a wet cloth. Ji-yeon's fever was still high, and her cough wouldn't stop. Bobby gave her water, but Ji-yeon couldn't drink it. She opened her eyes and whispered to Bobby to sing. Bobby was surprised for a moment but realized what Ji-yeon meant. Ji-yeon wanted to remind him of a song his mother used to sing to him. Bobby didn't know a Korean song, but when he saw the pleading in Ji-yeon's eyes, he felt he had to do something. Ji-yeon started humming a melody in a small voice. It was a Korean folk song, and Ji-yeon's mother used to sing it to her every night. The melody was sad but warm. Bobby listened to the melody Ji-yeon hummed and tried to sing along. His voice was shaky, but a small smile appeared on Ji-yeon's face. Ji-yeon closed her eyes as she sang and remembered her mother. Bobby didn't understand the words, but he could feel the longing and love in Ji-yeon's voice. When the song ended, Ji-yeon hugged Bobby and whispered, "Thank you, Hyung." Bobby didn't understand the words, but he felt Ji-yeon's gratitude. At that moment, however, Ji-yeon's breathing became even weaker. Bobby checked her pulse and realized that her heart was beating very slowly. Ji-yeon's condition was deteriorating, and there was nothing Bobby could do. Bobby took Ji-yeon in his arms and hugged her. She opened her eyes one last time and looked at Bobby. There was a peace in her eyes, as if she had seen her mother and father. Bobby took Ji-yeon's hand and told her to calm down. But at that moment, an explosion was heard in the distance. North Korean soldiers had approached the riverbank and detonated a mortar. Bobby hid Ji-yeon behind a rock and readied his rifle. The soldiers surrounded the rock and spotted Bobby. Bobby opened fire and hit one soldier, but other soldiers were shooting at him. Bobby was hit in the leg by a bullet, but he kept fighting. Ji-yeon was lying behind the rock and looking at Bobby. She smiled one last time and closed her eyes. Bobby saw Ji-yeon smile, but the shadow of war was once again darkening innocence. Sergeant Robert Lawson was hiding with Ji-yeon behind a rock on the riverbank. In the village near Incheon, North Korean soldiers found them and detonated a mortar. Bobby hid behind a rock to protect Ji-yeon and opened fire on the soldiers. Ji-yeon was an 8-year-old Korean girl who had lost her family in the war and sought refuge with Bobby. The cold weather and hunger made Ji-yeon sick, and her cough and fever intensified. Ji-yeon sang a song from her mother and sent Bobby one last smile. But Ji-yeon's breathing became weak, and she closed her eyes. Bobby checked Ji-yeon's pulse and realized that her heart was beating very slowly. At the same moment, North Korean soldiers surrounded the rock and targeted Bobby. Bobby was hit in the leg by a bullet, but he kept fighting. Ji-yeon lay motionless behind the rock as Bobby fired at the soldiers. Bobby looked at Ji-yeon for a moment and saw that her eyes were closed. Ji-yeon's small hands were still clutching the letter from her mother. Bobby shot another soldier, but he was almost out of ammunition. The soldiers had completely surrounded the rock and kept firing at Bobby. Bobby was hit in the shoulder by a bullet and collapsed, but he made one last effort to protect Ji-yeon. He pulled out a grenade and threw it at the soldiers. The explosion scattered the soldiers, and Bobby took the opportunity to pick up Ji-yeon. He started to run along the river, but the wounds in his leg and shoulder were slowing him down. Ji-yeon's breathing was no longer audible, and Bobby could feel it. Bobby reached under a tree by the river and laid Ji-yeon on the ground. She was motionless and her face was pale. Bobby checked Ji-yeon's pulse once more, But there was no heartbeat. Ji-yeon had succumbed to the cold and hunger. Bobby hugged Ji-yeon's small body and began to cry. The innocence of this little girl in the middle of the war shook Bobby deeply. He took the letter from Ji-yeon's hand and looked at the drawing on the letter once more. There was a mother, a father, and a little girl. Bobby put the letter on Ji-yeon's chest and stroked her hair. Ji-yeon still had that last smile on her face and looked peaceful, as if she was reunited with her mom and dad. Bobby looked for a place to bury Ji-yeon. He found a soft patch of earth on the bank of the river and started digging with the butt of his rifle. The snow was still falling, and Bobby's wounds were bleeding. But he didn't stop. He couldn't leave Ji-yeon in the snow. As he dug, Bobby thought of his own family. He remembered his younger sister Emily, whom he had left behind in America. Emily was innocent like Ji-yeon, and Bobby had kept fighting for her. But he hadn't been able to save Ji-yeon, and that failure hurt Bobby deeply. When Bobby finished digging, he wrapped Ji-yeon in a blanket and placed her in the grave. He put the letter next to Ji-yeon. Snowflakes began to cover Ji-yeon's grave, and Bobby knelt at the grave. Bobby prayed for Ji-yeon and made her a promise. When the war was over, he would return to Ji-yeon's village and keep her memory alive. But then an explosion was heard in the distance. North Korean soldiers were still nearby and had found Bobby. Bobby picked up his rifle and looked one last time at Ji-yeon's grave. Ji-yeon's smile never left his eyes. Bobby walked towards the soldiers and continued to fight. But this battle no longer meant anything to him. Ji-yeon's death had changed Bobby forever. A grave in the snow was the last refuge of Ji-yeon's innocence, and Bobby would carry that pain for the rest of his life.